people's lips, global careers, remote working, how do we deal with that? So I would encourage you to please ask questions, comment, and we'll deal with those once Nikki has finished with her talk. But keep adding the questions. And I'd like to introduce Nikki Taga. She's the head of talent management and at Investec. She's the guru on all things talent management, people management, and what we need to be doing in this day and age to see how do we work effectively, efficiently, and in a healthy manner in this new paradigm that we find ourselves in, and that we really are not quite sure where we're going. So welcome. Thank you so much, Nikki. We really appreciate your time. I know that you are really, really busy, and I'm going to say over to you, and everybody, please ask questions.
Thank you so much. Thanks. It's a privilege to have been invited to come and share, I suppose, some of our thinking and some of the knowledge. I'm definitely not a guru. I don't think anyone's a guru as yet, specifically with regards to this subject, but hopefully I give you a little bit of food for thought in terms of what organizations are thinking through, what should be top of mind for leadership in organizations at the moment, and the kind of paradigm that we're sitting in that can either create chaos in my mind if people don't give it enough thought, or could really shift organizations to do something incredibly creative and could really get us to think incredibly differently about the traditional workplace. So I'm going to pop up the presentation. Hopefully I get this right for you all. Jane, please tell me when it is on. Is it there?
Not yet.
How do I get back in? Do I get back in? I need your help.
We can hear you talking, Hanley. Let me try again. Share. Hold on 2 secs.
Yes.
There we go.
Okay, got it. Thank you. So thanks very much. I mean, the topic was around remote working. I have taken liberty to speak a little bit more around the future state of work, because I think remote working is just an aspect. And unfortunately, it's a little bit linear in terms of the way that we need to start thinking. So I'm going to jump straight into it. But obviously, remote working, we've got to start prepping ourselves and starting to think around how can we create hybrid ways of working for people? How do we truly start crafting a digital employee experience for people that are coming into organizations? And how do we think around flexibility in its truest form? Flexibility is starting to ask us questions around where do I work, when, with whom, what work do I do, etc. So if we go all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, which was really the space that started the form of the workplace, the traditional workplace as we would know it. And if you think about the pace of change over the last 200 years, and how stuff has changed in terms of it having continuously evolved, but the pace has been so much slower. Now, if you take us over just the last 30 years, and you think around how technology has forced a change in the way that we connect, we collaborate, we communicate. And then now if we go to the last kind of 18 months to 2 years and how it has fundamentally changed what we think about organizations and the way that we look at things like talent management. So it really has proved to us that people can work effectively outside of traditional office spaces. The stats that they've done and the research that they've done over the last 2 years is they really can't, in most organizations, show that performance has dropped. Yes, there have been organizations that have underperformed, but it's really been through, the economy that they've been finding themselves, and not necessarily in terms of the way that human resources have been contributing towards the organization. And so there's lots for us to learn. But this is my own positioning statement, no one else's. But in this world that is continuously changing, how do we remain competitive in the way that we would think around talent management, etc.? So where we find ourselves right now, what is top of mind for organizations is people starting to say the context is normalizing. And how do we define our new normal? So this is what leaders should be thinking about. And we are concerned that leaders are trying to move too quickly to normalize the way that we have been working versus really understanding how we start to define and craft this in a far more conscious way to deliver an employee experience that is going to make your organization far more competitive. And research needs to come around the valuable learnings over that last 2-year period of time. And we have to start considering all the way back from basics. And when I say back from basics, people speak to things like culture eats strategy for breakfast, etc. I know you've all heard that saying. I don't believe you can split culture and strategy, actually. Culture and strategy are one in itself. That's why I've put it as one point. But we need to go back to considering what is the culture of the organization? What are the principles of our organization's culture? And how much can we design within that specific culture with its values, with its principles in the way that we allow people to work? What is the strategy of your organization and how much input do you take in terms of the way that people can work from that? How do you start to define this digital workplace or digital work experience for people? We gave so much thought when we used to be in a building to the traditional workplace. Are you honestly spending time around crafting the digital workplace and the digital employee experience for people? Leadership capability, as we know, has changed, and we'll get to a little bit later, around maybe some of the fundamental attributes that really defines great leadership. So leadership needs to be upskilled, reskilled, or just supported in terms of navigating the space that we find ourselves now. How do we consider a spectrum of working models? We'll go through it now. How do we think about talent pools? And how does this all define your full talent management spectrum in terms of the way that you recruit, the way that you integrate and induct people, the way that you look at performance management? What are the inputs? What are the outputs? The way that you look at things like retention, succession, development, etc. All of that needs to be considered when we're thinking about this new normal that people think is easy to integrate into. And my last personal statement point is really this is a learning process. And so the organizations I think that are going to win through this, specifically around talent, are the ones that are going to be able to allow their organizations to experiment and to adjust as quickly as they can in order to learn and go forward. The next 2 slides are from Gartner, which I have borrowed, but I have stated that it is from them. But if you think about the past, very simple slide, but if you think about the past, we thought about an office-centric design. So the environment was an in-person environment. And if you were to go back here, you could lose up to 39% of your workforce, is what their research shows. Here's a very interesting fact. There was research done with quite a large population of people, and they asked people, if you got offered a double-digit salary increase to go back to the office in a normal 5-day work week, 8.5 hours a day with very little flexibility, double-digit increase or keep the option of flexibility, what would you choose? 71% of people said that they would choose remaining in some form of flexible working environment. Why? People's priorities have changed, having gone through COVID. They have reevaluated life. They have now listed what is important to them. And it is not about going back to that traditional workplace where their lives were semi-dictated by the organization's policies and principles. Option 2, we go into your present, which is a virtual office-centric design, which is a remote working environment. If you continue doing this, there are absolutely advantages, but there are lots of disadvantages too. Advantages, which I know you would all already know about, are things like reduced estate costs for organizations. And as a startup, if you think about it, your entry-level costs now, if you're starting your own business, would be far less than they would have been. It is not even expected that you would have an office place for clients to come and visit, etc. And so this option is there, and there are advantages of doing so. But as we know, the biggest disadvantage is around fatigue levels. And what we are noticing more so than even just fatigue levels is the mental health and the issues around mental health that people are experiencing. So it's got advantages, but it's definitely got disadvantages that people do need to think through and be able to support. And then the last model is obviously what you could think about in terms of your future and what you'd like to craft and create here. and most organizations are starting to think about a hybrid environment. It gives you the advantages and disadvantages of obviously the first two options here. There's a study in the US at the moment, I think it was completed at the end of August. 44% of companies are saying that no one can be remote, which means that they are asking people to go back to the traditional workplace. 16% of organizations are saying that they are going fully remote. And at the moment, they're noticing that 40% have offered some form of a hybrid model. And they're noticing that that percentage is increasing month by month. So it's going to be interesting to see where we end up, but we are assuming that most people will go towards some form of a hybrid model. Oh, sorry, this is not showing properly on the screen, but anyway, that's my PowerPoint skills for you. This is from Gartner again. The main aspects are absolutely here. But when redesigning your work for the hybrid world, these are the things that we need to think about. The office-centric design did provide consistent work experiences for people. So if you think about consistent work experience, it goes back to the traditional workplace again. Desks, work hours, T's and C's were all the same for people. The human-centric design is rather offering this flexible work experience for people. So it's a quality of opportunity, and that's an important statement there. It is not asking for sameness to equal fairness for people, in my mind. This is my translation of this. What it is speaking to is the equality of opportunity in terms of choice. Give people equal choice, unless the job stipulates something different. And my example there would be if you are joining a role that's in a call center, and for some reason you do need to go to an office space to go and do your shift, which is defined by certain hours. If the job requires something different, I get that. And I think people are contracting up front for the role requires certain behaviors. But if not, your organization should allow for equal choice for people. How they choose to take up the choices that you offer them is totally up to them. And that creates the flexibility, as we know. Obviously, the office-centric design enabled serendipitous collaboration. So that was around, we are there, we are together, we are working on something, and innovation happens by chance. What we need to think about in this new design is intentional collaboration. How do you get teams of people into spaces where they are bringing diversity of thought so you can compete on the best innovation from your organization going forward? That is something that we have to consider. And if I had to give you a stab at what organizations, specifically senior leaders, are the most concerned to lose, it's this. They are very concerned to lose innovation by chance, and they're not 100% sure at the moment on how to create this innovation by design. And I think it's going to hold lots of people back. And obviously in the office-centric way, we used to drive visibility-based management. We used to call it management by walkabout, MBO. I'm sure you've all heard of that before. And now it really is around this new form of management where performance becomes the outcome and the leadership style is incredibly different. So here the drive is impacting the world of work. And I've written there with speed, thanks to COVID, because these things are not moving slowly anymore, not that they ever did, but they truly are working incredibly fast and moving incredibly fast. So do we have the right skills to build a future fit, agile organization? It is what is going to keep us competitive. We have to think about it. Technology is going to continue to enable us. It is enabling us now, but more will come out of technology, specifically around things like AI and automation. So technology enablement is an absolute opportunity for us. It is also a threat unless we start reskilling people whose roles may become redundant in future. This increased level of flexibility, which is leading towards increased productivity, but how are we thinking about it and leading within it? The shift here around work-life integration, when I started my career 20 years ago or so, we all spoke around work-life balance. And we wondered why we couldn't achieve it because there was no such thing. Then it became, could we look at things like work-life integration? Yes, that's a far more realistic view. Work-life balance, I couldn't switch on half of Nikki Taga to go into the corporate world and do what I needed to do and think I wasn't thinking about Nikki Taga in my personal capacity as a mother and a wife, etc. But this work-life integration is a far more realistic view, and how do we think about enabling it for people? The ability and the agility of organizations to adapt. Your pace of response is going to be important here. And that's where I say, fail fast, learn quickly, it will give us the agility. And then the generations, we have spoken a lot in HR around baby boomers and the different types of generations that are coming into our organizations. And we're going to speak about something called digital immigrants that people are not thinking about, and the different generations around digital adaptation and ways of working. How are we organizing ourselves? With whom am I working? What type of work am I doing? Where and when? So here are the new two generations that you have to think about, apart from the generic ones that most of us do know. In organizations, we will have digital immigrants. Those are people who really would choose face-to-face interaction prior to anything else. And then there are lots of generations that are obviously digital natives. And those are the people that do not need face-to-face interaction, and they could do most things online. So we are finding quite a difference in the different generations in this, showing us that we have to enable both. And how do we get certain groups of people here to learn from one another in order to shift? But it's going to be very interesting creating our workforce with these two different generations sitting in them. So we need to think through these 6 things when designing, and we're going to go into design now. But how do we support the change in working styles? How do we unify this online and offline communication experience for people? How do we, as I say, start crafting an employee experience that would bring together your traditional physical work environment and this virtual one? How do you make it seamless that when I'm sitting at my virtual desk at home on a Wednesday and a Friday, and I go into the office on another day, the experience for me is relatively seamless, specifically on things like your organizational culture and the way that you think about that. Okay, how would you support this work environment for people to keep them connected, to ensure that we're balancing things like privacy, risk, etc., that we have to consider? Can we support the leaders in terms of capability that's needed, and how you're going to win the war of talent? Because it's getting progressive. And my biggest point on winning the war on talent now is the talent pool has gone global. So ourselves at the moment at Investec, we are recruiting people way outside the jurisdictions that we used to. Why? Because we now have learned how to integrate people, how to get people performing, and how to connect them with teams in a hybrid model. So if we find the best technology talent sitting in Mumbai, for example, why wouldn't we recruit that person into the team that's currently sitting in South Africa? So how do you start to think about not only your digital workplace, but this digital workforce that you've got to consider too? So here are the 5 states of remote working. There's credit to where I've got the information from. But a colleague of mine and I, Peter Kurtzen, some of you may have known of him. I think he was somehow associated to some communities here, but him and I did a big piece of work for the organization recently. And what we started to speak about was the 5 states of remote working. So the first state was this level 1. So when we went to COVID, level 5, we all hit this emergency state where we had no choice, but we had to get people at home. And we didn't know what people were doing, and we weren't 100% sure if they were fully functioning. Level 2 actually just became a copy and paste model. So when people wanted to start contributing and getting active, we noticed that most people just worked 8 hours a day, Monday to Friday. But most people were sitting online for those full 8 hours of work. The next 2 levels become interesting for us. I think most organizations are sitting in level 3 at the moment. So we'll speak about level 3. We'll speak about level 4, which becomes far more interesting for us, around asynchronous communication, which actually enables people to do far more, for far greater work for us. And level 5 becomes that nirvana. We're not 100% sure exactly what it's going to look like, but it really would be that you design your work around your life and not designing your life around your work. which will be interesting to all live through and see. So here's level 3. I'm going to speak very quickly through it. But obviously technology, we're enabled around the way that we're working remotely. But most people, as I say, were utilizing the same types of behaviors, but they were just using technology to do so. So technology did allow us to do collaborative work. We use video conferencing. Suddenly we are all very good at Teams and all of these other tools that we weren't used to using before. Meetings typically became a lot more focused. Actually, people were very efficient. You weren't wasting time having that cup of coffee or that informal chat. And so we saw some efficiencies coming through in terms of these stages. New skills came through 100%. Companies started to see things like writing skills became more vital. We weren't sitting and presenting to people. We were writing a lot of research, lots of documents, etc. But the challenge was that people were used to working in the old way. They started to reject some of the approaches that we were seeing. And the concern here is that you're abandoning the ability to experiment and actually create far more capable teams. Level 4 is the one that we should be more interested to start experimenting with. This is where we start to see the true value in remote working. The difference in this level is we're starting to get to what we call asynchronous communication. Synchronous communication, very simply, means that we're forced immediately to give response. So unfortunately, this starts to force us to adapt or adopt the same schedules as one another. So you'll see in teams, the organization may offer flexibility, but in teams, people are scheduling and solving around each other's schedules in order to give this immediate response. So, for example, if our team chose to work Monday and Tuesday virtually, you would notice that people are working in a very similar way. They're working from the Monday to Tuesday at a certain time period in order to do this. Where we really start giving people the freedom to operate is if we can get organizations into this asynchronous communication space, where it does not require an immediate response. Obviously, if it is something urgent, someone could pick up a phone or give an instant message. But otherwise, through the tools that we would use, people could choose when to come in and respond. You would need to think about advantages and disadvantages 100%, which we'll go into, and you would need to start designing principles in the way that people responded and worked versus this policy-based organizational thinking. A principle could be something like, there is a 24-hour turnaround time in order to get something out to a colleague, etc. So principles and contracting principles would be important for teams here. So I've gone through this a little bit here, but the problem with the synchronous communication is this is where we're starting to see the exhaustion. This is where we're starting to see the mental illnesses coming through because people are just continuously on. They're so concerned not to be able to get back to people immediately. And this is the concern here and where the exhaustion's coming through. We've spoken a little bit around this, around the upsides of the asynchronous communication in organizations, but it gives people a better ability to plan, far less stress. The deeper work becomes default actually in your organization, which is interesting. You can hire and operate globally. So when I spoke just now around thinking about a global workforce, this is the way that we're going to have to think. If you've got people in different time zones, it's going to be the way that we're going to have to think and manage talent. You can track when people work, so you can shift to this judgment around, produce equals output based, which is where we're wanting to go. And I'll show you in a moment just now around performance management. And it becomes the space that you're giving this freedom to operate. People can decide when to work, how to operate within their own teams, etc. So when we consider, so now what we have spoken about there is that there are different levels of remote working, 100%. Now we've got to start deciding for ourselves what models could we consider. The first thing we need to start with is culture in my mind. As I said, culture and strategy for me are totally interlinked. Your culture should be the context on which you will deliver your strategy. But you need to think about your culture. And in Investec, one of our principles, for example, or one of our absolute values is that relationships are our currency, because relationships help us get work done at Investec. So we would have a principle, for example, defined by our culture as we could never be a fully virtual organization. So these principles start to define the parameters in which you can design your remote working model that's going to work for your business. So things like access, relationship, and process for Investec are incredibly important. It will influence the model options that we could offer teams. Your business strategy is the next thing. How does your strategy influence your team objectives all the way down into your individual objectives? How much flexibility can you offer based on the strategy of what you have to deliver as an organization to your stakeholders? And then we have to think about the team conditions. How does the team function? You know, what is the nature of their work? We had the call center example previously. Maybe the function of the actual role would define the types of models that you could offer. What is the tenure of the team? I know it sounds a strange thing, but it is very difficult for newer people to integrate, upskill, and get up and running. It takes slightly longer in a virtual approach. I'm not saying that it cannot be done, and I'm happy to see, I'm hoping that it's going to improve even more so. But what's the tenure of your team? How used to working are they? What is the relationship based amongst the people in the team, etc.? What would be the risk considerations for you? What does it mean from a privacy perspective in terms of client information going out your organization? What technology needs to exist? Do you have the right tools and capabilities to offer people? What size is your organization, etc.? And I'm sure there are far more conditions that we could start to think about. And then finally, the individual conditions are important. And I think this is where teams need to co-contract with one another to truly understand the conditions of not only the team, but each individual that makes up that team. And I'm seeing a lot of complexity come through in this space. I'll give you an example. I mean, we speak about electricity supply in South Africa. Do people all have the same contingency plan? Some of us are very privileged to be able to have generators or inverters to back us up. But what about the people that don't or can't afford such a thing? Will the company support it or not? Or does that have to be a consideration around the way that we ask people to work? There are also things like travel. I keep speaking to people around, we've got a new statement around privilege and more underprivileged people. It's fine to ask me to get into my car during, COVID outbreaks and drive to work. But for other people that are maybe traveling using public transport or a further distance, how do we consider those types of things when thinking about the individual conditions in teams? Now we get to the criteria of actually assessing the models. So that is, the previous questions have given you the optionality for your organization. And I will show you some of the models, but the different types that you could really brainstorm on those 4 critical pillars. When you have got your options, then you need to start thinking through these 6 pillars that are going to be important. How do you think about, and these have become obviously more around your talent management capability as well. In your new model selection, how does learning and performance happen? Things to consider is, how do we share knowledge as a team? How do we coach, mentor, manage performance? Network and weak ties will be a consideration around relationship building. How do we get interaction amongst teams? Where are our formal processes, our informal processes, etc.? How does it influence hierarchy and power distance within your organization? Creativity and innovation. We spoke about this a little bit around the synchronous communication and asynchronized communication here. How do we get creativity in teams to still happen within the operating model that we do choose? Elements to consider in your employee experience would be things like belonging and inclusion. How does it shift belonging and inclusion in your organization? How do we think about career growth progression? You must consider your reward implications if there are. Client engagement. For example, if you've got client-facing teams, the types of models that they would think through, you would have to consider their engagement with your clients. How do we respond to clients timelessly? In which way would we entertain clients these days based on the model selection? And finally, your team functioning. Participation is going to be important, leadership and decision making, your freedom to operate and the flexibility that you offer. Team meetings, when do teams get together? What's the agenda of those meetings that would happen? So here's an example to pull it all together for you. So here's a very simple model, obviously, that a lot of organizations would be thinking about. Half in, half out. So certain days of the week, half of your team may be in the office and half of the team may be remote still. Your key characteristics, obviously, is it would be formally scheduled around when you alternate to be in and out the office. Generally, people are targeting 50% of people to be in the office in this type of a model. And it could be rostered around days or weeks, however teams chose to do it. So thinking through those things before that we spoke about, you would have to have critical questions around how do you manage team processes in terms of your team meetings? How do you include the remote individuals? How could teams avoid a new sub-split? If you're splitting your team into two different, a red team and a blue team based on who's in and out, how do you avoid that split amongst your team? Could you create a way that you have you change up the composition regularly so you don't have such cross-pollination between your red and blue team, etc. So then you would take the model that you have decided to think through with your team. You would understand what the biggest challenge is, but then you would start to define those 6 buckets that we spoke through. So in your half in, half out model, if that is what that team had chosen, they need to just start defining learning and performance. When will they learn together? How? What does performance look like? How do we give each other feedback? How do we contract objectives? How do we ensure our objectives are aligned to strategy? We spoke about the network and weak ties. You'd go through that with your teams and start to define what it would mean for them. Where do they create space for creativity and innovation? Even if it's an operational team, how do they start to challenge the processes that are in design in order to get more effective or more efficient? Employee experience, client outcomes, and team dynamics. So you would take your model and you would superimpose these 6 pillars. And I think the best way to do it would be in dialogue with the teams versus dictating again to them, but let them think through these 6 critical aspects of team performance and let them contract the way that they're going to try and experiment. Lastly, I want to bring our attention to a simple concept, but I'm sure you all do know about a mental model. But I'm saying I think we must consider it as another iceberg to be concerned about. So a mental model is a worldview that we obviously carry around in our minds. And I think mental models will either enable us or disable us. If we do not consider them, we will potentially be disabled. And what I mean by that is leaders in organizations may have a mental model around long hours means hard work. No matter how beautiful the model is that you offer your organization, no matter how much consideration you've given to it, planning you've given to it, etc., if your leaders consciously or unconsciously hold a mental model around work hours equals performance, it is going to undermine and your model will break and it won't perform for you. So go into your organization and sit with leaders. I think that they're a little bit scared to tell us what they're truly thinking around flexibility, remote working, etc. I think they are worried about being shamed with regards to not being able to adapt to the new way of work. But I think it's an important conversation to have with them to help them understand what mental models they may hold that may hold your organization back in order for you to educate them or find ways to inspire them to actually shift their thinking around those specific mental models. I'll give you another one very quickly. I think leaders are wanting lots of people back in the office. Why? Their preference or their personal bias is around enjoying being back in a traditional workplace. That's absolutely fantastic if they can own it. But unless they can see that they're carrying around that mental model around work happens in Grayston Drive or in the Milpark building, etc., unless they can consider that and see it, it will naturally undermine any form of hybrid model that you're trying to offer your organization. Finally, the 6 leadership qualities that I think are going to be necessary for us in a hybrid work environment. Decisiveness, really having the courage to decide on things. I think it is quick decisiveness, but also quick to change your mind. That would be important here. So I think it's about making quick decisions, giving it a go, being agile enough to then change our minds as leaders. Empathy is going to be hugely important, as you've all heard, around the human side and the human aspect of connecting with people. Taking the lead is going to be important to stabilize organizations and give strong guidance, give input. You don't have to be expert to give input. It could be an opinion, but what it will do is it will encourage other opinions and inputs coming through. Transparency is huge. That's why I'm saying even be transparent enough to say you hold a mental model about something. But transparency is going to be huge in terms of continually embedding trust in our organizations. Leading teams in office, working from home, holding both environments top of mind. And this consistent, reliable, fact-based communication will really start to reduce stress and anxiety of uncertainty for people. And I am done. So I'm going to stop sharing.
Thanks, Nikki. That you've given so many. I've got pages of questions that I want to ask you. So I'd like to encourage people to ask questions in the box or in the comments there. I see that Kobus has said relationship is our currency. He thinks that's excellent, and I think that is so, especially where we are now. So one of the things that I want to just get your opinion on. So we've got to build a trust between team members, between leaders and you know, everybody. Now, how do you, and we're looking at empathy as well, because that is really important. And I think perhaps that's an underutilized term, or you know, we don't want to be seen as, I don't know if people think empathy is weakness, or, you know, like if you're too kind or whatever. But so how do you manage the kind of the discipline of ensuring that those outputs are done or are achieved, while still trying to be empathetic, make sure you're building trust, you are remote? What kind of mechanisms do you think would work there? Because if you suddenly are now fatigued and you then lose it with someone, everything you've built up is gone. But now you know, it's kind of, I've now had enough. Where have you been? Meantime, they've had no electricity for 2 days.
Yes.
So it's those kind of issues.
Yeah, it is, and it is complicated. The first thing that I'd say about output is to focus on output-based performance, and not input equals output equals performance. So if you think about a lot in the past, we used to think about how much input was given, and people focused on the input, which is strange. So people used to focus on, you know, they used to make blanket statements like, oh, he's working so hard. And you know, the consideration of hard work equaled great performance. Well, what about the person who didn't work that hard but gave you the same level of performance? Why should it have been a consideration for you? Things like, have you noticed that so-and-so must get rewarded because the hours that they've spent in the office is just, you know, incredible. Why, again, ours is an input versus an output-based performance thinking. So around output, we really need to focus on output-based performance. We shouldn't be considering things like, you know, how much that person traveled, or how many times they went into the office, how many hours they worked to get the job done. It is about the person that got the job done. And we have an inspiring CFO, and she once said to me, she said, if you had 2 students that were writing a test, and the one student did the whole exam in an hour and a half and got 85%, and the other person took 3 hours and got you 70%. Who's the better performer in that test? She said, naturally, it's the one that did it in an hour and a half and got the 85%, because all you should care about is the 85%, you know, and the fact that they could even do it quicker, well, good for them. So I really think, first of all, we need to redefine the thought process around performance and focus on the output-based performance and not input-based performance. That will shift something fundamentally for us around that. And then around creating trust and empathy and thinking about that. I think it is hard for leaders, I must admit. I think it's very tough for them to say things like, I don't understand how to work with all the psychology that I'm seeing in organizations right now. You know, we had a leader the other day and they said, you know, all you people in HR are so lucky because you're all trained in psychology. And all I've done in the last year and a half is try to support people at a psychological level. So I think you do need to create platforms to support your leaders because they are not experts in it. And none of us are, but I'm saying they're not experts in it. They are needing places to debrief with one another. They're needing places to learn from each other, and they are needing emotional support as much as your organization is. So that feeling of strength that you're wanting from them is getting them to a place in my mind where they can be human with their teams. And human means that myself as a leader can come in and tell a story about having really experienced anxiety. Or me as a leader telling people how much I'm battling around managing kiddies on Zoom schooling and having to do my work. So I think that's where trust is going to be built. It is at a really human level versus anything else. It is for a leader to say, guys, I'm so sorry I came in and chat on everyone. I wasn't in a great space, but this is why. Why.
Yeah. And I think also then going back to the mindset thinking and to realize that showing your team, and I don't know if this is also a generational issue or if it's through everybody, but to really show your team that you are vulnerable, because, you know, as a leader, you're not supposed to be. So being able to show that in terms of, you know what, I don't want to show that I'm vulnerable because it's horrible to be in that position. And I think changing that mindset.
100%. And my last point on this is, and it's not in play at the moment, but we think about leadership as a role at the moment. We think about it as a role that one person holds. How can we get teams to think about how they could distribute the leadership responsibility? And that is not abdicating responsibilities. It's a very big thing if a leader can walk into a team and say, you know what, you're much better, Jane, at doing X, Y, and Z. You're much better at holding team context than I am. I can see it in your training. Maybe it's because you've been a psychologist, doesn't matter what it is. Jane, can I ask you in the team to take up the role of leadership when it comes to creating the context and the team environment, for example? So it's also about leadership, identifying what they're good at and what they're not, and starting to utilize people in the team that maybe hold attributes that they don't. And to really distribute and think about passing on responsibility to people in the team that may be better at certain things than others. And I think, again, that will create trust because it'll show your own vulnerability and you'll be very honest about it. And then you could ask other people to step in where you would potentially need support.
I really like that idea. I'm going to start. I've made a note of that. Look, my team members that are on, things are happening. So also coming back, we've had new team members start who we haven't seen in the flesh. How do you find the onboarding and getting them into the team? What do you have any? I don't want to say tips and tricks, but kind of. What processes do you think are valuable to ensure that the people eventually feel as though that they're one of the team, you know?
Yeah. So what we've actually done is we've actually extended our recruitment process, and this is an interesting concept for people. So Koba's commented on relationships is our currency. I still believe it is, and for most organizations it should be. So what we have started to do is to extend the recruitment process to allow for more people to be involved in it than less. Why? Because it actually starts your integration process if you believe that relationships are incredibly important. So in the past, for example, if you had a recruitment process that was maybe 2 conversations and maybe it was 4 people that were in that process with the individual, think about expanding those panels or think about expanding it to more conversations. Because we need to portray our organization's culture to people that aren't even walking into our building. So if we go back to the most simplistic definition of culture being the way we do things, okay? So if you think about it as a religious culture, as a a certain culture in a country, and it is the way that you just do things. It's the same thing in organizations. We make it very complex, but it's just the way that we do things. It's the way that we talk, walk, interact with each other, the way that we deliver to clients, etc. So what they are not getting in the recruitment process right now is that lived experience of culture by being able to walk through the building. So by putting lots of your people into conversations with the potential candidate, what they are unconsciously observing is the way that you do things by watching a group of you interact versus just a one-on-one conversation. So I think that helps around letting them choose your culture, your organization based on a cultural experience. And the only way that we can create it virtually, I think, is to put a whole lot of your people in the room with them. They will notice the language we use amongst each other, the way that we dress, Jane, etc. So that's interesting. It creates a better integration, and they suddenly have met 20 people just through that process that they can call upon, ask questions, etc. They may feel far more comfortable approaching you, if I was their leader, to say, Jane, Nikki spoke to me about picking up X, Y, and Z. I don't even know what she's speaking about. Where do I find that thing? So it's that. You do need to formalize a little bit more in terms of the tactical stuff around integration, equipping them with the right tools, telling them that we use Microsoft Teams for this, telling them that we use WhatsApp for this. So those kind of norms around the tools that you use, you do need to become more explicit for them, which we'd never considered before. You know, it was Outlook and then ask your friend that was sitting next to you. And you need to be more explicit in enrolling them into your team behaviors. So being explicit around when we meet, how we put things on the agenda, how do we communicate with each other, how quickly do we need to respond to stuff. You need to speak through those things in my mind a lot more than we naturally would have, because they would have just observed behavior. But if the poor person is sitting at home for their first 5 days, how do they know those things unless you have explicit conversations? So I don't think it's anything too sophisticated in my mind. I'm sure there are other organizations that are doing great stuff with technology and things to enable it. But give them stuff to read like you would have naturally, but just more. Have more conscious conversations around the way that we do things and our behaviors and the way that we perform, just to get them going, and then let them allow them to ask questions and to navigate from there.
Yeah, because I think I've really come across that you assume people should just know these things. I mean, how on earth are they going to know these things when, you know, they're sitting in their home office? So I think that's and that's something that we as a team need to do. And, you know, obviously HR does their part, but I think line managers need to become far more involved in that, in making that adoption. So looking at that, how do you then work if you are recruiting globally and you've got different time zones, and how do you integrate those people into the operational or the team areas?
So I'm not sure that you can have every function globally, so don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
A leadership role would be very difficult, I think, if you couldn't be in person with certain people in your team. Only for us. If you are Google or Twitter or an organization where you're probably leading through technology and tools in any case, maybe you could, but for some organizations you just can't. So I don't think that you can consider all roles to be global, but the ones that you can consider, I'm not sure. I think you're going to have to go on some of the basic fundamentals again. Yes, you're going to have to find a time zone overlap. And in that person's working model, when you went through all those different considerations, on the team pillar consideration, you're going to have to contract with that person, that there are a certain amount of hours that person is on virtually, so that they can get connection to team and deliver to team objective, team output, team performance. So you're going to have to consider crafting the condition of working together in the way that that person may have to have, you know, whatever, from 3 until 5 p.m. they're going to have to be online when the rest of the team is available to do the collaboration and connection work. The rest of the work they could do anytime, because the rest of you are asleep in any event. But yeah, I think you're going to have to just consider some of the conditions in which they connect specifically with team.
Yeah. So that's very interesting to see that. And just looking at it, with our laws here, in terms of getting somebody, say, from Mumbai to be, how do you navigate that? I mean, it's quite a tricky one, I would
It
suspect.
absolutely is. We're lucky that we're a dual listed entity in South Africa and in the UK because we're trying to use both considerations. It's tax. That's your biggest issue.
Yeah.
Around where people are performing or giving output to. It makes it easier if you're an international or global business, but if you're not, it makes it far more difficult. You're going to run into labor considerations like tax, like the way that you contract. But if a person is a supplier to your organization, it has got less limitations. So people are looking at supplier type of relationships with people versus the formal employment type of relationship, where a person might be contracting to you and delivering a service or an output versus a permanent employee. So I think people are getting a little bit more creative in the way that we think about contracting people, around contracting capacity versus or output or skill set versus contracting you as a human being and you work full time for an organization. So that will open up a lot of optionality for us.
Because I think that also then gives you a lot more flexibility for both the person who's giving you their services as well as for the organization to really get what is needed. I think that's very, very important. Another thing I want to touch on is, when you talked about the fatigue and the mental health, and that we can see it coming through. I can see it. There's lots being written about that. Again, what types of interventions or considerations? I know a lot of organizations have ICAS and something like that. Do the employees actually know? Do they take it up? What kind of considerations or what kind of ideas would you put forward to help leaders cope? Because also it's often, why aren't you just coping? Like you should be. You look fine. You look as though you're coping because you're smiling, you're laughing. Meantime, it's a coping mechanism. What kind of things could we be doing?
So I think with our younger generations in our organization, and I even think about my own children, I'm going to bring in a theme with my own children around counseling actually being a lifelong skill, to be quite honest. So when we all went into this world of work and we all went virtual, about 6 months into it, I battled. Absolutely no doubt. And I did share it with my team. And I said, I'm really battling. I'm battling to figure out what I'm passionate about and my hobbies. It made me question a lot. And instead of sitting in the confusion and creating anxiety for myself, I went into a counseling relationship. And I found a person that I trusted and I liked working with, and I worked with her for about a 6-month period. I felt well after that, and it was enough for me to have got what I needed out of it. So I do believe that we need to normalize counseling, coaching, psychology, whatever you would like to call it in your organization, that it is not for people that are dysfunctional or not well. Actually, some of the well people are the people that utilize it more on a regular basis, actually. So number one, we need to get a new mindset around counseling and what it does mean for people. And it's actually a life skill potentially for people versus not being well. And then I think it is around lifestyle choices for people and really starting at the bottom around right now. I had a person in my own team, we were chatting yesterday, and she's feeling very anxious and overwhelmed. And I said to her, what exercise are you doing? No, none. I'm going from my bedroom to my desk and from my desk to my bedroom. So it is going back to some of the fundamental basics around what's your physical well-being look like? How are you exercising? What you're eating? What's your lifestyle, what's your sleep like? Then it is to go to far more of the mental and the psychological levels for people. Organizations, I think, have invested a lot more. If I look at well-being on the priority list from an HR perspective, it is now top. It is top, where well-being used to be only for companies who really could consider it, but it was really down here, So well-being is a priority. It is there. It's one of the top 4 in my mind around your employee experience and your employee value proposition. Well-being is one of it. I actually had a person even in an interview process ask around how we support people at a psychological level at Investec. What is our offering? We are lucky enough to offer an employee assistance program. People can do it relatively cheaply. You don't have to be a large organization to do so. But people really are investing in something. But the utilization will only be there if you normalize the mindset around what it is. But that is, again, where leaders can be human, can show their own vulnerability, and can speak through their own experience. People will then start to take it up.
Follow suit. And I think that is an important consideration, and to start doing that. And then one of the other areas in terms of this is, as we said, you're always on. So somebody can contact you whenever, whether it's via Teams, via WhatsApp, via phone. So I think those principles that you spoke about are a very good way of looking at this instead of the policy thing. And I think that is a very valuable observation for me. And is it that important to get the answer right now?
100%.
Yeah.
And that I think if you actually had to go back into all of your policy documents, this is just me, and I'm a little bit of a maverick when it comes to things like this, but if you had to actually go and read your policy document now, how many people have actually read it? How many of you abide to it? What does it really stand for in your organization, etc.? Go look at Netflix culture document. Go look at people like, who else has got one? There's a company called Brewdog. Go and look at Brewdog's culture document. For me, what they make explicit in those documents are far more powerful than any policy document could be, because they start to speak about principles that you cannot break. Human beings are intelligent. If they connect with the principle, you're going to get what you want, versus tell them a rule and ask them to stick for it, because some of the rules are becoming redundant is the thing here. Yes, and they're not making sense. So absolutely, it is around saying, we don't communicate with each other after 5 o'clock. If you need me, phone me, but don't expect me to be online. Or if it's something urgent around that asynchronized communication, phone me or WhatsApp me, because it could be 2 o'clock in the afternoon and I could be on the cricket field watching my child play cricket. So start to develop those principles that would release people from that feeling of always on.
That is wonderful. I think we are almost out of time. So I'd just like to say again, thank you so much, Nikki. You've really given us food for thought. I think this is a really important topic and concept, and things that are going to be evolving quite rapidly over the next few years. So I think we'll be coming back to this again and again and seeing how we're going to be working in the future. And it's quite exciting, a little bit daunting, but we're in it. So I think we need to just be in it, embrace it, and as you say, fail quickly, learn quickly. So we really appreciate your time, and everybody, thank you for being there on the side there. I see we've got one question. Let me see if we can quickly. Whoever says, the increased free-floating anxiety, multiple anxieties, but inability to specify what exactly causes the anxiety, breaks down social bonding in the team. So Nikki, have you got any advice on how leaders can help team members to identify the or an object of anxiety in order to craft strategy to address that object of anxiety to help improve the social bond? So it's that free-floating anxiety that is present.
Sure. I wish I had an answer, and if you get the answer, please make contact with me, because I am seeing it. So the biggest form of well-being issue that we're seeing is this level of anxiety that you're talking to, and I think that the reason why people can't locate what the anxiety is exactly, what the root cause of the anxiety is because we've just allowed it to layer. We've just allowed it to layer, and it's been incredible for people. It's been such a stressful time, the pressure, the loss, everything that people have gone through. They cannot mourn normally. It's just been so much. And I might really challenge your thinking there, and I'm so very sorry if I do, and I could be wrong, because I'm actually not a psychologist. I didn't even study psychology, but my concern for people is when they are stuck in that state of absolute anxiety. They are stuck and they've got no movement at all. So I really think it is around them taking time, get them out of the routine that they are experiencing, give them time to work from the bottom up if they can't work at the emotional level. Get them into a new routine, eating well, maybe getting up and actually doing an exercise, actually maybe seeing some people. So get them into a shift of a routine, because I think that mundane routine is only making it worse. And then, yes, Marianne said create space for introspection, 100%. But I think that they're so scared to go there because they're so scared to break, because they're at rock bottom. Let's start to build a foundation for them and then give them time to break, for sure, with support, obviously, and then let them go into a space of introspection. And I think sometimes it's just as simple for them as creating the space that they can acknowledge the loss. What have they lost? Why are they in that stage? And some of it is not loss only through death. It is loss of routine, loss of interaction, loss of the workplace, whatever it is for them. And then let them rebuild from there.
Great.
But thanks, Jane. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much. And I hope to come. I hope I'm now on the network and I'm allowed to come and learn from others. So I look forward to it.
Definitely. Thanks, Nikki. We really appreciate it. We'll definitely be seeing you soon.
Such a pleasure. Cheers,
Thanks,
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.